Nairobi following Tuesday's demonstrations. But before we get to that, I'll start with you, Demas, on this.
Yes.
The Constitution, 13 years later, we've had this Constitution, the Chapter 4 of the Bill of Rights. But how clear is this Constitution, though?
Well, we are fortunate enough to have one of the most progressive constitutions. And this Constitution is transformative because it is centered around human rights. If you look at everything that goes on in the Constitution, it is trying to preserve the human dignity of every person, regardless. And so 13 years later, we struggle with issues of enforcement of human rights and lack of respect of human rights, mainly by the executive. Mm-hmm. However, there has been an improvement of human rights standards in Kenya. There has been an improvement even in aspects of policing in Kenya. But we find that we struggle to get out of the regime policing, whereby the police are there to protect the regime rather than there to protect your human rights and the Constitution. And so when it looks like we transformed from before independence, a police that was created by the colonialists to protect the crown. And then when we got independence, the political class became the reason for the protection of police.
Right.
And after 2010, we said, let us now realign it to the Kenyan people. We created a policing oversight authority. We created a National Police Service Commission to deal with human resource issues of the police. We created an independent Inspector General with independent IAU, the independent body that investigates police within the police. But we see that this transformative things that we give ourselves is starting to be eroded.
Right.
However, the courts continue to play an important role in protecting and standing in the space for Kenyans against excesses by the executive and parliament. And we really are very happy that the courts have really held that ground. And to some extent, sometimes the DPP does hold that ground because you see sometimes when a person is charged with something frivolous, the DPP refuses to charge.
Right.
And so all these stages of oversight, of independence have come to help. But we are saying that it looks like this independence is under threat. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Rutok, again, still in the same question, Chapter 4, the whole Bill of Rights, how clear is it? Do we still understand our human rights as stipulated 13 years later?
Thank you very much for having me. We need to understand that once the Constitution was passed and 13 years down the road, indeed today, as we sit here, more Kenyans have a better understanding of what human rights is. And at least when you walk to any bystander or any reasonable individual within the society, today they are able to say at least that I know my rights. Even when they are protesting, you would not miss seeing Kenyans saying haki yetu. And when they demand for their rights, it means that they have an anchorage within our Constitution. Right from Article 19 all the way to 59 brings about a myriad, a bevy of rights that would seek to preserve dignity, preserve life, preserve how we relate with one another in a spirit of brotherhood, as we borrowed them heavily from the international instruments. Right. And even our regional instruments. And so to me, when you ask me about whether Kenyans are having a better understanding, I say yes, there is a significant improvement. And more importantly, there are various systems of checks and balances to ensure that these rights are safeguarded. To the common mwananchi, they understand that they do have rights. Now, as to how we implement and how we realize them is another conversation altogether, and to the extent in which we've been able to ensure that these rights are promoted.
I love the fact that you went there because I was actually heading there. Yesterday, your boss, the chair of KNCHR, Roselyn Odede, mentioned a number of things, and we'll actually get to listen to that soundbite later on. But then largely, condemning the state agents' actions on during the demos that we have seen, led by Azimio la Umoja. Walk us through what is what basically she was talking about here. As much as you say, yes, Kenyans understand their rights, but implementing them. So it really seems as if the commission is faulting state agents and even the police for excessive force and a number of not really following human rights of Kenyans. Speak on that.
Thank you very much. The upshot of the statement that was issued by the chairperson, Roselyn Odede, of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights was to bring to attention the need for the observance and the respect for human rights and the rule of law within our country. And this is stemming from the actions that we've witnessed across various parts of the country, where there has been suppression of the right to expression. There has been incidences where we've seen torture being conducted or being meted out to Kenyans who are protesting or who are not even resisting arrest, and even the conditions in which operations of the state agencies such as the National Police Service in terms of de-escalating and dealing with protesters has brought to question many issues in respect to how they conduct themselves, in respect to how they should adhere to various rules and regulations that they are provided for. And so the issue has been that we need to respect the freedom against torture, cruel and degrading treatment or punishment, that it is not excusable that such acts be conducted. When we see officers beating senselessly someone who has already surrendered, who is laying on the ground, then it brings to question whether they have an understanding of their own service standing orders. Even when they break into homes and abuse the right to privacy, abuse the spaces that, such as schools, when tear gas is thrown within the vicinity of school premises, or when you see a person with disability either beaten up, then it brings to question as to whether the officers who are operating, whether they are following the command structures and the operation orders that they are set out when carrying out their duties. And so the upshot of yesterday was that we cannot suspend human rights, even during times of unrest or when there is political instability, for instance. You cannot suspend human rights, and it has to be upheld at all times. And we were calling for the accountability, especially for any person, any officer who has been found culpable for any wrongdoing during this time of protests.
Right. Demas, even as you come in on this, number one, I also understand, your legal mind. So what does the law say about, after a police either shoots a civilian, what happens next? And also, has the police abused their power?
Definitely, there have been very many instances that we've witnessed or reported of police use of unlawful force. I don't even like saying excessive force, I say unlawful force, because the use of force by police must be accountable, proportionate, reasonable. We have seen instances where it is sometimes force is used in a blanket manner, or sometimes force is used against someone who's already subdued. Under the National Police Service standing orders, the 6th schedule, if a police officer injures any person, they need to report that injury to their commanding officer, who must report that injury to the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. That does not happen. The same applies to when someone is killed during an operation. And this brings into question the issue of individual and command responsibility. And by the way, we have a message even for police officers who are acting with impunity right now.
Right.
Currently, there are 12 commanding officers who have been charged under the International Crimes Act for the death or are surrounding what happened to Baby Pendo. And in the initial years, nothing was happening, but actually IPOA was doing investigations.
Right.
And they found that there were many lapses in terms of even when whatever happened, for example, a 6-month-old baby was clobbered in the head to death,
Okay.
right? There were no reports by the police and so on and so forth. But they went and used the International Crimes Act and have charged these 12 individuals with rape, murder, and torture. And they are now trying to defend themselves in the Constitutional Court, first of all,
Right.
until they take plea.
Okay.
But what is the message? The message is that you might think you are doing the government of the day a favor, but when the law comes for you, it will come for you individually.
And before you answer now the second one, to form even a larger basis of this conversation, I promised you the sound bites. One by Rosalind Odede, who's the chair of the KNCHR, and also a section of residents in Kiamaiko here in Nairobi. Let's listen into that before we continue.
Tume ya IPOA ifanye uchunguzi kwa njia ya haraka na halali ili wale wanapatikana na hatia waweze kujibu mashtaka haya. It was disheartening to see tear gas lobbed into schools and homes.
Jina yangu ni Amina Galawe, hapa ni Kiamaiko, na leo wameua ndugu yetu bure. Hajawahi iba, hajawahi fanyia mtu kitu mbaya. Wamekuja askari wamekosa kitu ya kukula, wamezoea askari wa hii Kiamaiko hapa kwa hii post ya Huruma Post. Wanajua waizi ni wakina nani, waizi wanaiba wanakulanga na hawa. Waizi gonga waizi washika, waizi wanatembea free hapa ndani, hawashikwi. Wanaua na bunduki, waizi wako na bunduki na ni hawa wanawauzia marisasi. Ni hawa wanawapatia hizo mabunduki, lakini wanakuja kuua ndugu yetu bure mwenye hajawahi fanyia mtu kitu. Tunataka justice. Tunataka justice. Na hii government yetu ya Ruto, kama mumeambia askari watuue ovyo ovyo, askari hakuwa naua hapa Kiamaiko, lakini saa hii kwanza mumewapea authority ya kuua askari, wanatuua hapa bure. Wanapiga watoto wetu bure.
Aitwa Galano wako Galano. Tunataka justice ya huyo kijana, ameuliwa bure bila hatia, ametoka kwa nyumba yake, akapata kijana amefungwa pingu, akasema usimwizi muachilieni, wakamgeukia wakampiga risasi.
Right, on just a context of that, so yesterday there was an unrest in Kiamaiko in Nairobi after one person was allegedly killed by a police officer. According to a section of the residents there, they say this person was telling the police officers that the person they had arrested was not a thief. So, according to these residents, the police officers turned on this man and killed him. Davis, you're speaking on this. And before we actually play the sound bites, you're talking about Baby Pendo.
Yes.
This is years back, but then now this is just recent. It's actually hours, after this incident in Kiamaiko happened.
Yes.
Again, have the police abused their power?
Yes, indeed. If you follow all the statements coming out of the human rights sector, including the government body that is charged with promotion and protection of human rights, there has been incidences of where you can say there's been torture, there have been incidences of unlawful use of force and firearms. Remember that in the March protests, children died because of tear gas getting into their houses and they suffocated. 2 babies died actually. And so if you look at it from a wider lens, you realize that these things are actually systemic. For example, extrajudicial killings in Kenya happen in 3 arenas. The first one is when the police are saying they are fighting crime, especially in urban poor areas. The second one is the fight against against terrorism.
Right.
And the third one is actually during political times, especially protests. And you see a spike in extrajudicial killings during protests. And so perhaps we need to look at what our operation guidelines are, what kind of weapons we use during protests. We have seen over the past decade, for example, sometimes people are killed at their balconies just because of the kind of rifles that we use. We've seen babies die due to tear gas. And so our policing methods are wrong. And I also think that the Public Order Act has become ancient. The Public Order Act actually came into Kenya during the Mau Mau repression period.
So I feel like it needs...
Yeah, we need to align our Public Order Act with the Article 37 and also all the laws that deal with human rights during protests.
The fact that you even mentioned that, I remember Senator Samson Cherargei mentioning that they're really seeking to have a change in the Public Order Act, and matters even also articles that mention the rights to picket. According to them, they have have a law to have demonstrators boxed to a particular corner. Maybe if it's a section of Nairobi, just that particular corner, they demonstrate there. Will this limit the law?
There was a judgment by one Justice Makau that actually suggested some sort of responsibility for protesters.
Right.
And there also have been proposals, but you have to note that these proposals always come from people who at the time are politically correct.
Okay.
But we have seen in Kenya that once power shifts or alignments shift, the people who thought they would be enjoying these rights get to the other side of things. And so I would like to encourage our legislators not to think about these laws as a way of repressing opposition. For example, these laws are supposed to facilitate the right to protest. The right to protest, by the way, all over the world has led to positive change. The fight against racism in Kenya, the fight for multipartyism, for democracy, has been through this right to protest. And so this right is very important. And what we're trying to say is that we need a law that would now breathe life into the right to protest,
right,
not try to limit it to what the government of the day would be comfortable with. We have seen the former president speak like he very distressed over what is happening to him.
Yeah.
But we also remember what his regime was known for in terms of sometimes unlawful arrests, Kamata Fridays and things like that. So what we're trying to say is that let's have equality before the law, and let's all respect the Constitution and the law for everyone, not for the time we are in power, for us to abuse, and then which will create that situation where we all become blind, because it means that as power goes round, it oppresses everyone.
Wakili Rochok, as an advocate, the whole limiting of right to protest, right to picket, even as such, as the Senator Cherargei says, and even other legislators say that they would want to have a law to have, box demonstrators to a particular corner in maybe even the streets of Nairobi or maybe parts of the country where they can demonstrate. How does this really limit the rights of power?
Yes, thank you.
Protesting.
Thank you for that question. I'd like to point out the current bill that is sponsored within Parliament that seeks to put organizers of any demonstrations or picketing to bear responsibility for any damage or anything that occurs within the protest, so that they're held to account. Then secondly, of course, limiting the sections in which individuals are able to pass through. And to us, our initial reaction to it is that it actually limits the right to demonstrate, picket, and even present petitions. There are various guidelines in terms of realizing this right that are internationally accepted, that even our country has assented to. And there are even additional general comments now to speak in generality as to how best we can realize this right to demonstrate and picket. Our Constitution has captured it well. It puts some ingredients that for you to demonstrate, picket, and issue out petitions, you need to be peaceful and you need to be unarmed.
briefly, before we take a short break, do you agree with Kiprono that we need a change in the Public Order Act? He says it's ancient. Is it really ancient?
Yes, I would say that indeed there is need for reviewing it. And in fact, one of the guiding principles is that law, especially on how to regulate protests and even the use of firearms within that context, should be reviewed periodically. So that rights of individuals are promoted, and there should be a better framework in which how we handle protests. We've seen officers bring out issues about you failed to issue out a notice and therefore your protest is unlawful, and they've used various provisions of this act to limit that idea of ensuring that Kenyans are facilitated so that they are able to express themselves and the displeasure or even seek their concerns to be addressed in a particular way.
Right. Let's take a short break right about now. But then when we come back, I really want to get into, we have seen different bodies and different agencies of the government mentioning a number of maybe injuries, deaths, those who are arrested, and there really seems to be conflicting. I have KNCHR here, I have Amnesty Kenya here. I want to get into where are we getting these numbers from? Stick around. Remember, the question is, do you really understand your human rights as a Kenyan? 13 years later, after we had the 2010 Constitution. You're watching Morning Cafe. The hashtag is Morning Cafe at TV47 News, number 2047. Send in your questions and feedback. Right, welcome back. This is Morning Cafe, about 33 minutes past the top of the hour. We're discussing defending human rights. Do you understand your human rights? It is in Chapter 4, the Bill of Rights. But then do you really understand them? Okay, fine. You may understand them, but then do you really feel like the government of the day understands your rights? When you walk along the streets of wherever you live, do you feel like people around you even understand your own human rights and have the sharpest of minds? For that, Demas Kiprono, who's a campaign manager at the Amnesty Kenya, and also Elijah Rutok, who's an advocate and a senior human rights officer, the KNCHR. Before the break, we were talking, legal matters pertaining human rights. And I want to get into the numbers pertaining the injuries that we've seen, the number of deaths that have been reported. So far, Amnesty Kenya, I believe you have had your own, number of injuries. I don't know, was it last month or early this month?
So last month we conducted, we did a report. So we did an investigation.
All right.
The happenings of the last month. So what the numbers that we gave out last month were pertaining to the deaths that took place in the March protest.
Okay.
Right now, we are collating the numbers for the latest round of protests.
So after March 20th,
yes,
March, April, May, June.
Yes.
So you release now in June.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it technically takes about 2 months to have.
It depends on many issues. But for example, we have reliable information that a combination of all the protests up to what happened even in the last week is the number is about 30. I know the Independent Medical Legal Unit, IMLU, which really deals with issues of extrajudicial killings and torture, has a number of 37.
Right.
Yeah. But this differs usually because of the different methods used in verification.
Right.
However, we have something called the Missing Voices Alliance, which we are part of, IMLU is part of, Haki Africa is part of, that does annual verification and investigations into death, and we usually issue a report. And I'm sure in next year's report, we will have numbers that are incidental to the protests.
Right.
Yeah.
Last week we did see demonstrations Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Yes.
There were deaths reported, there were injuries reported from both civilians and also the police.
Yes.
There was also property damaged. Technically, when are we likely to see such a report? The figures for this maybe later. How easy or how hard is it to get such these details? Because you'd say it span across the country. From different counties, Nairobi, Kisumu, Homa Bay, Nakuru, just to mention but a few. Even in Machakos, Kajiado County, in Kitengela, how easy or how hard is it to get this data?
It depends on many things. It depends on cooperation by the duty bearers. The duty bearers include the police officers and sometimes hospitals, and also the access anyone investigating has on victims and their families. And so whenever there's an attempt to conceal these things, then it becomes challenging to get that information. However, organizations have their own unique methods of getting this information based on their presence in an area. So the challenge is, for example, that one organization might not have information about a certain area just because they don't have monitors in that area.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then the fact that now we have KNCHR here, I believe you sit at the very top of and you really have the advantage at a vantage point. I believe also your chair also sits the board of IPOA, so you may truly be close to the numbers. So far, what can you tell us?
At the moment, our officers are on the ground. They are investigating, working together with not only the police, but families of victims. They are visiting hospitals, and they are also in touch with first responders who, that includes institutions such as MSF and the Kenya Red Cross, who would quickly respond to some of the incidences that occurred, especially when it comes to gross injury and even death. And so at this moment, we are in the process of concluding our investigations, and we shall be in a position to release a substantive report based on the findings that we have gotten and also the interactions. The importance of this is that...
Okay, before you continue, just to clear the air. So the report that you're going to give, for which month is it?
This would now capture the incidences for the demonstrations in the recent past. I think it will go back as early as March to collate ever since the demonstrations began.
So there are no standalone collated results, or rather numbers for March 20th?
At the moment, no, because of the verification of all these injuries and the deaths. The importance is so that we gather sufficient evidence, and there is a threshold that we've set out so that in terms of pursuing accountability, remember we have to collaborate with agencies such as IPOA and even the ODPP, so that once you give them information that they can be able to rely on and even take sufficient action, and even the IAU, that's the Internal Affairs Unit, can also come in and look into some of the conduct of the officers who can be identified, that who breached some of the regulations that they have set out.
Right. So, for example, because there have been allegations that, number one, police officers might be gagged to report the number of deaths, allegedly, either deaths or injuries. And also this applies to hospitals, hospitals in particular areas, and those prone to where the demonstrations happened. They allegedly might be gagged to, report the exact figure. So how do you certify that, for example, in Mathare, there's a Mathare hospital there, so maybe 5 people are injured. How do you ascertain that actually it is true that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people were injured in this around this area and they were taken to Mathare hospital?
I just want to point out that we do have some powers that enable us to conduct such, to verify and conduct our due diligence. For example, the power of entry, either through a court order, the power to issue summons, the power to even issue out statements, to allow persons to issue to us statements under oath. And with such, we are able to conduct investigations individually as an agency on matters human rights, on any incidents of torture or cruel and degrading treatment. And with that, we engage directly with the victims of these families. So when someone says, I was shot, I was injured, then we would come, verify that information, and even try and get to the respective jurisdiction of the station in which such an occurrence occurred. We would follow up and see whether, if this matter was reported, if it was not, we would even assist these victims report themselves these incidences, or find out whether they want to report or not. And with that, also we would ask for medical records. We would ask for further information to see whether this death was recorded or not. And if not, we would find out and ask then the police why such a death has not been recorded. And if they have an OB number, then we would follow up on that specific matter to see the level and the state of which the investigations have gone, so that we are able to unearth some of the issues, and whether, if the victims have a problem in terms of trust, then we would assist them, collate and package the information so that we see some semblance of redress, some semblance of action being taken towards addressing their concerns.
You've mentioned trust, and I was heading there. Just briefly before I get to Akili Kiprono, do you get a backlash when you're investigating? You visit a family, maybe the injuries. Do you get a backlash? Because at the end of the day, the back of the mind of this family, they will think, fine, the commission is here, maybe talking to me, but then when they leave, the police around this area, they know me. The agencies around here, they know this family, so they might come back to ask me, why was I giving this information?
Thank you for that question. In terms of trust and in terms of safety and security of the individual who comes to us with information, we would verify and look at the stature of on case-by-case basis. We have the privilege, again, of sitting within the board of the Witness Protection Agency. And where, in the circumstance that an individual is fearing for their lives or fearing reprisals, we do take some necessary steps to ensure that if this person is to participate in a case that would involve either they are seeking accountability against officers, that adequate arrangements are made so that this person's safety, and including their family, is guaranteed. And also, we would seek out if specific officers have been identified, then we would go to their superiors to ensure that these officers are called out, and therefore they take note that some investigations are being conducted in relation to their conduct, and also to inform them of the need for them to adhere to the law, and that they should refrain from either interfering with witnesses or interfering with the process of investigations.
Right.
And also the law empowers us to create an offense if you try and interfere with some of the work that the Commission seeks to pursue.
All right, Wakili, what's now, at the end of the day, the end goal of all this? You know, collating all this, deaths, the injuries and all this. Because one would ask, would Amnesty, for example, partner with the police or other, offer you told me Amnesty partner and other human rights bodies, but then does it partner with the police? And speak also on the whole partnership, the general partnership, because at the end of the day, we'd want to see, no deaths, no injuries.
Yes.
Peaceful, because at the end of the day, that's the big word there. Peaceful protests, peaceful demonstrations, raising the voice. If it is high cost of living, that is what people are saying in the streets without any of this.
Yes.
So, and I believe each and every single body and each and every single party wants that at the end of the day. So what is the end goal of collating all this?
First of all, there is something called the right to truth, which means that the right of every human rights violation, especially the ones of a systemic nature, to be exposed and for redress to be gotten on behalf of the victims. So that is number one. Number two is that the National Police Service, as it is set up, was created to embrace community policing. And we are actually part of and at the forefront of community policing. In fact, the areas in which we have engaged with police commanders actually see a reduction in violent confrontation between the community and the police, because actually these people know each other. A notification becomes a very easy thing to do. In fact, you can just call an officer or Wambia, this tomorrow we will be doing this because of this reason.
Okay.
And so there's that mutual respect and understanding of each other. Another thing is that when you document, then the chances of justice are higher.
Okay.
For example, police officers are not just deployed haphazardly. Police officers, there has to be a signal sent for officers X, Y, and Z to be in a certain area. And if something happens and it's a government bullet that did that thing, then it is only those X, Y, and Z and their commander who will be asked what happened here. And the Baby Pendo case that I'm telling you is a good example of justice taking long, yes, but now we will get answers as to why certain things happened in a certain area. Because really, there were atrocities that happened. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights documented about 201 cases of rape in that context of 2017.
Right.
And then let's also ask ourselves, we were talking about dialogue earlier. When this dialogue happens, what happens to the victims? Because what we have seen is dialogue happens, people move on, and then
at the end of the day, the
no
family
justice
asks,
for the people who were beaten in the streets.
And the fact that you mentioned justice, you're coming there. Speak on the independence of justice, because yesterday we did hear KNCHR talking about how basically the independence of justice. I'll get that quote later on as you continue. But then speak on the independence of the judiciary at this moment.
Yes, so first of all, the judiciary just deals with what comes to it, right? The judiciary does not move itself on cases. So if it's a criminal matter, it has to have come from the DPP and perhaps the DCI, and so on and so forth. Inspector General, who does not take instructions from the executive. But what we have seen actually in the last 13 years is ministers or cabinet secretaries giving oral directions to the Inspector General, when under the law, under Article 245, any directions given by the state to the National Police Service must be done in writing and must be on policy issues. They cannot tell The government cannot tell the Inspector General to arrest someone, but the DPP can tell the Inspector General to investigate someone. But what we have seen is that we have not really embraced that police reforms that we were supposed to, and which is a challenge to us. Yeah.
Right. Ratok, okay, I've got it here. Just to quote what even your boss was talking about yesterday. So in part, it says, the Commission urges the government to ensure the protection of the judicial spaces and uphold its independence, allowing citizens and journalists to exercise their right to freedom of expression and access to information without fear of intimidation of reprisals. All right. In continues, this infringement also affected lawyers and families of the arrested, thus infringing the right to access legal support and access to justice. This is it's a dicey issue, because on one hand, if you're talking about a police officer may be killed, this particular person, yesterday we did see the Permanent Secretary of Interior saying one officer has been killed so far, 305 injured. So it works both ways for the civilians and also the police. But then at the end of the day, when they walk in the corridors of justice, the corridors of justice are dark.
Let me just put into context. The statement was in response specifically to the incident where we saw journalists and some members of the public are chased away from the precincts of the court. And in fact, the judiciary issued out a statement condemning such. And I would just want to point out that the manner in which the National Police Service has conducted itself, especially in terms of how it relates to the media, has really negatively affected our country in the sense that we dropped from position 69 last year. Now we are at 116 in terms of World Press Freedom Index. And it is unfortunate, because if you affect persons who are doing their duty, protecting the freedom of expression, because it's through the glare of the camera, through the reporting that we get from members of the media, that information is now critical, and it's able to inform everyone within the country of the information that they so require. And so when you see journalists and persons either treated in an inhumane manner when they are conducting their duty, then it is indeed disheartening. I'd like also to point out the issue about arrests. We've seen arbitrary arrests. We've seen political leaders, persons who are of good standing and of good, who have influence within our society, arrested, and in a manner that flouts various provisions of our laws. If you don't inform someone why, the reason why you arrest them, if you hold them incommunicado, leaving them in the dark in the sense that their family members are not able to access them, even their lawyers, even anyone who can be of assistance are not able to assist them, that it would take a court case to be filed of habeas corpus, meaning to produce these people before a court of law, so that action is seen to be taken. Or if you take an individual and push them around the country, today they are in this police station, tomorrow they are in another, yet you don't confine them within the jurisdiction of where the arrest was done, then it flouts, it really brings issues around abduction, issues around even the identification of officers when they come to arrest. You cannot have police in civilians who do not have any identification badges or numbers within their outer garments, arresting people haywire.
But I believe the Public Order Act gives permission to police officers in plain clothes.
Yes, even in plain clothes. The importance, let me cite the service standing orders. Any police officer on duty in plain or in civilian clothing must, and I'll emphasize must, have an identification badge or their number on their outer garment. The importance is for them for any member, any reasonable member, to be able to identify the difference between an officer and a civilian. Because what the impact of that is that you will have police who will now claim when you try and seek accountability, they say, those were not our officers. You will hear political leaders from any part of the divide saying, those were not our people. They would even lead to a lot of blame game and the denial of any acts that were conducted. And so it brings to question why and how, whether the National Police Service is really keen on observing its service standing orders and its regulations. Right. And so the ultimate of this is that we need to preserve the independence of the National Police Service. We need to safeguard with the rule of law and to ensure that the precincts of any judiciary, any school should be safe spaces where the public can walk in and out in a peaceful way and in a place they know that their rights and their freedoms are going to be protected at all times.
How clear is the law on a police officer identifying themselves before they make an arrest? For example, we did see, I don't know if you're privileged to see the video of a plainclothes officer arresting a protester by the name Juma in, I think it was in Mathare, who was masquerading as a journalist and then arrested him from the back. How clear is the law on how such a police officer should identify himself first before they make this arrest? I'll start with you before we come to you.
Yes, the regulations and specific to the service standing orders is that, as I had mentioned, you should identify yourself.
Have a badge? Mm-hmm.
Have a badge, and even before you use force, it should be commensurate with the nature of the seriousness of the crime that is. Now, in such a situation, when you masquerade as a journalist, the implication is that you will create immediately a mistrust from the public and even the journalists, thereby even further endangering any journalist who is doing their duty and who are the genuine journalists from any person who is purporting to or who is fictitious. And the danger even in terms of that officer engaging in plain clothes without bearing the necessary equipment for such incidences that can really escalate into bad situations, bad scenes. Then that officer was in plain clothes as to compared with the others who had at least some gear. And when you find individuals who do not identify themselves, then what to date? I can ask, who is that officer?
Okay, that's rhetorical. I'll take that. Yes. We're really out of time. So still on the same, and police officers, even in the National Police Service would argue, as a police officer, they have their own human rights. Even as you know, your parting shots. Where does the law lie on the rights, the human rights for a civilian and also the police officer? Does it work both ways for a police officer?
Our police officers are human beings and thus have all the human rights everyone else has. Yeah. If you attack a police officer in a way that endangers their life, they have a right to use force to disable you. That should be clear. However, you have to remember that our police officers are trained, are armed. And then the government and the Constitution, the Constitution especially, gives the police powers of arrest, powers of making certain judgments. And so with great power comes great responsibility. And then, so we must hold them to that high standard. Let me give you an example. For instance, we've had very violent protests in France for the past month or so. That was due to the extrajudicial killing of one person of, I think, was Algerian descent. Yeah. Amidst all that violence, there's not even one death. There was arson, destruction of property, looting, not even one death. At the same time, there was a leader who actually created a fund to fundraise for the officer responsible because he had been using now some divisive rhetoric to say that, oh, these are foreigners who are coming to destroy their country. Do you know what? That individual was arrested and is facing charges. Now, juxtapose that to our country. we usually say that because people are looting, they need to be shot. No, if you are looting, you need to be arrested and taken through the criminal justice system. What we are seeing is now violations of freedom of speech, be either from the media side or from using certain laws like the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act, which I fought in court unsuccessfully the High Court, and we are now at the appeal stage.
All right.
We've seen arbitrary arrests. We've seen people moved around from police stations. These are the ingredients we had for unlawful detention, the ingredients for extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. That, for example, that happened to our colleague Willie Kimani. It is those kinds of behavior. And so we are saying that our police officers must be professional, must be human rights compliant, and must be accountable.
Right.
Because they serve us, the people of Kenya.
Your parting shots, I believe a minute each.
My parting shot, having done this work for a long time, is really to say that what we are seeing is usually happens during hot political times in this country. And perhaps we need to ask ourselves how we can push ourselves forward in terms of respecting equality before the law, the rule of law, and constitutionalism. Because what we see is a revolving door of the transience of power. So you see, at some point, it is the guys who are in Kenya Kwanza now, a few years ago, who could not move around freely. Right now, and this is because power has shifted.
Okay.
But we want respect of rights regardless of affiliation.
Great stuff. Wakili, talk.
Thank you very much. Mine is just to first call upon Kenyans to observe the rule of law whenever they are doing any protests. It is wrong for you to take up stones and pelt out towards police officers. Demonstrations does not mean that you must take up stones, you must barricade roads, you must cause mayhem. You can actually walk peacefully, hold hands, present your petition, and go back home. And it has been done before in many places. To our officers, we do understand that the welfare issues and the circumstances that you work within our country are at times difficult. But there is no excuse to suspend human rights in conducting your duty. And so we call upon all officers to ensure that indeed they must observe the rule of law, they must adhere to their service standing orders. When you are conducting or addressing issues relating to protests, please note that in your conduct, when in terms of pursuing accountability, you will be held liable individually, and also as a commander, you will be held individually responsible for the actions of the officers who are under your command during such the quelling of protests.
Okay.
And so when we see the loss of life, when we see the damage of property, when we see acts of wanton torture, then it brings to concern of everyone that we need to reflect and ask ourselves where we are heading as a country. And with the need for us to not suspend human rights at all times and have the respect is of great importance.
Asante sana. Great place to wrap up this particular conversation. Thank you, gentlemen, for spewing the legal wisdom right about here. And asante sana for sticking around.